Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So picture a society that is just, dripping in unprecedented, almost unimaginable wealth.
Right, yeah.
The national borders are expanding rapidly, securing these incredibly lucrative new trade routes. The markets are absolutely surging, and the upper classes are building not just primary residences, but winter houses and summer houses out of hewn stone. They're draping the interiors in imported ivory.
Just absolute luxury.
Exactly. And they attend these massive, elaborate religious festivals, sacrificing the absolute best of their flocks, while grand choirs sing a complex, beautiful music. If you were just looking at the macroeconomic metrics and the volume of religious activity, you would declare this a golden age. You'd think, wow, this civilization is at its peak.
And paper, yeah, they look incredible.
But if you look just a little closer, right outside the gates of those beautiful estates, something horrific is happening. People are being sold into slavery for the price of a pair of cheap sandals. The grain the working class is forced to buy has been swept off the floor, like intentionally mixed with dirt and chaff, just to stretch the profit margins of the merchants.
Yeah, it's brutal.
And the justice system isn't a place of equity. It's essentially a toll booth where the highest bidder always wins. Now, this isn't some dystopian novel, right? And it isn't a critique of a modern superpower. This is the Northern Kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC. We are stepping into the ancient, searing book of Amos today. Specifically, we're looking at chapters 7 through 9, those final visions that close out this profound text. We'll be leaning heavily on the text itself, alongside the insights of two master historical commentators, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry. Our goal in this deep dive is to act as your guides, helping you navigate this difficult landscape to extract, enduring moral insight and practical wisdom for your own life today. But to really understand the gravity of what we're about to discuss, we have to grasp the sheer cognitive dissonance of the era, right?
That dissonance is, it's really the key to unlocking the entire text. We're situated right in the middle of the reign of Jeroboam II. And historically speaking, the traditional enemy of Israel, the Arameans in Damascus, they had been significantly weakened by the Assyrians.
Okay.
And because the Assyrians were dealing with their own internal strife at this particular moment, this massive geopolitical power vacuum opened up. And Jeroboam II, he ruthlessly and successfully exploited it. He expanded Israel's territory to dimensions it literally hadn't seen since the days of Solomon.
Wow.
And with that territorial expansion came control of the major trade highways. So wealth just poured into the capital city of Samaria like a flood. But as the wealth grew, the moral center of the nation completely collapsed.
Right, because the society used to be agrarian, right? Families owned their ancestral plots, supported each other.
Exactly. But those agrarian roots were being systematically dismantled by an aggressive, predatory aristocracy. The elites, they figured out how to use the legal system to confiscate land from the poor, basically driving independent farmers into crushing debt and tenant farming.
Unbelievable.
What makes this era so utterly fascinating, though, and so dangerous, is that they didn't abandon their religion while they did this. In fact, they doubled down on it. The religious shrines at Bethel and Gilgal were bustling. They brought tithes, they offered sacrifices, they sang hymns.
So they were doing all the right religious things.
Right. They had constructed a culture that learned how to be incredibly wealthy, incredibly religious at the exact same time, while totally, completely abandoning the actual moral demands of justice and human dignity that their faith required.
Yeah, right into the middle of this booming, arrogant, deeply corrupt superpower steps Amos. And this is what I find so, compelling about him. He is the ultimate outsider. He isn't a politician maneuvering for influence. He isn't a professional priest on the state payroll.
No, not at all.
He's a herdsman. He's a blue-collar guy who tends to sycamore figs in the rugged, rural southern kingdom of Judah. He's looking at this northern superpower across the border, and God compels him to walk straight into the center of their wealth and power to blow the whistle on the entire operation.
Yeah, the courage that takes is astounding.
It really is. And the book reaches its climax with a series of intensely vivid visions, starting with a swarm of locusts and a devastating fire. Let's dig into the reality of that first vision. God shows Amos a swarm of locusts being formed, but the timing is incredibly specific. The text says it happens at the shooting up of the latter growth, right after the king's mowings. This isn't just a random bug infestation, is it? This is a highly targeted economic disaster.
It is entirely targeted, yes. And the agricultural details are really what give the vision its terror. In that ancient agrarian economy, taxation wasn't paid in currency, right? It was paid in produce.
Okay, so crops and stuff.
Right. The phrase king's mowings refers to the royal prerogative to take the first, most robust cutting of the spring grass and grain. The state required this to feed the royal cavalry, the military draft animals, and the massive administrative apparatus of the government.
Oh, wow. So they just scrape off the very best off the top.
Exactly. And the people had absolutely no choice but to hand it over. So they were entirely reliant on what came next, the aftergrass or the latter growth. This second growth was stimulated by the late spring rains. If that latter growth succeeded, the working class families would have enough to survive the dry summer and the winter.
If it failed,
they starved. It's that simple. Albert Barnes points out the profound vulnerability here. The king's storehouses are already full, the elites are totally insulated, but the common people are living on the absolute razor's edge of survival. So when God forms the locusts, right as this crucial aftergrass is spreading, it represents a complete, unmitigated systemic collapse for the most vulnerable people in the nation. It is the removal of their last possible lifeline.
Because a locust swarm in the ancient Near East, it wasn't just a bad harvest, it was an apocalyptic event. It's a cloud that blots out the sun, a deafening roar of millions of wings, and within hours, every single green shoot, every leaf, every piece of bark is stripped down to the bare earth. It leaves behind nothing but desolation.
Desolation, yeah.
And then the second vision amplifies the horror even further. Amos sees a fire so intense that it devours the great deep. Now, we aren't talking about a brush fire here, are we? The Great Deep refers to the subterranean aquifers, the underground reservoirs of water that feed the springs and the rivers. A fire that consumes the subterranean waters is a fire that consumes the very foundations of reality.
Yeah, Barnes provides a brilliant theological framing for this. Fire, throughout ancient wisdom literature, it stands as the ultimate symbol of supreme, inescapable judgment. A flood washes things away, sure, but the land remains. A famine starves, but the soil is still there. Fire, however, alters the chemical composition of what it touches. It leaves not even the outward form of what it destroys. So to envision a fire that burns so hot it evaporates the underground aquifers, it's envisioning the total unraveling of creation itself.
That's terrifying.
It is. The moisture that makes life possible is eradicated. It's a judgment of absolute finality. The people of Israel have built an entire society on the illusion of stability. You know, their stone houses, their military victories, their robust trade. But this vision reveals that the foundation beneath them is completely combustible. The wealth they think is solid is actually just dry tinder waiting for a spark.
But, the most crucial part of these first two visions isn't the terrifying imagery. It's how Amos actually responds to it. He doesn't stand there looking at this corrupt, exploitative society that is actively crushing the poor and say, finally, they're getting exactly what they deserve.
Which is what you might expect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He doesn't revel in the impending destruction of the people he's critiquing. Instead, he throws himself into the gap.
Wow.
He actively intercedes. He begs God to forgive and to stop. His plea is so simple, but it carries such immense emotional weight. He says, how could Jacob stand? For he is small.
Yeah.
He looks at this arrogant superpower, and beneath all their military might and their ivory beds, he sees their fundamental fragility. He advocates for them.
And this represents one of the most profound theological turning points in the entire text.
Yeah.
It establishes a core piece of wisdom. Mercy precedes judgment. Amos has been given the incredibly heavy burden of carrying a message of doom to a rebellious nation, yet he chooses to act as their defense attorney. Matthew Henry notes the profound implication of this moment, saying that praying people are literally a shield to a land. The prophet stands between the justice of God and the fragility of humanity, and the response from God is equally staggering. God relents. Twice, the text says, the Lord relented and declared, "It shall not be." God allows himself to be moved by the empathetic, desperate plea of a herdsman. It reveals a divine reluctance to destroy, an inherent desire to pardon rather than punish.
It's like a governor staying in execution when the prisoner's already strapped in.
Yeah.
Or, a dashboard warning light screaming red right before the engine block cracks, giving you one last chance to pull over.
I love that dashboard analogy, yeah.
But from a philosophical standpoint, I have to ask, this dynamic is deeply perplexing. If God is entirely omniscient, right, if he already knows exactly how corrupt this society is, and he already knows that Amos is going to plead for them, Why does he initiate this vision in the first place? Why show a human being the total destruction of the world just to have that human talk him out of it? Is this just some kind of divine psychological test?
Well, that is the essential question when dealing with the literature of divine visions. It's not about God changing his mind because he suddenly acquired new information. It's about God choosing to involve human beings in the moral governance of the world. By initiating this vision, God is inviting Amos into the divine council chamber. He's actively cultivating the prophet's empathy.
So Amos has to feel it.
Exactly. Amos has to viscerally feel the heat of the fire and see the devastation of the locusts so that his advocacy is genuine and desperate. If Amos is going to be a mouthpiece of God to the people, he must first prove that he cares for the people as much as God does. Furthermore, this intercession demonstrates to the reader and to history that when the final judgment does inevitably come, it was not a rush to anger.
Right.
It proves that every conceivable avenue of mercy, every possible delay was completely exhausted. The flashing warning light was ignored for far too long.
Which brings this ancient interaction right to your doorstep today for whoever's listening. We live in a culture that is incredibly quick to condemn. We love to write people off when they fail, when they make a moral error, or when they represent a system we despise. The instinct is to watch the fire burn and feel vindicated.
Oh, absolutely. The internet runs on that instinct.
It really does. But the wisdom of Amos challenges that fundamentally. You have to ask yourself, who are you standing in the gap for? How do you practice the difficult, deeply countercultural art of advocating for mercy for the flawed, failing people or communities around you? Can you look at a broken system, a toxic workplace, or a fractured family dynamic, and instead of just issuing a critique, can you step in and say, let's pause? How can they survive this? They are too small to withstand this collapse. That is the heavy lifting of true moral leadership.
It is the heaviest lifting of all, because while intercession is beautiful, and while mercy can delay the inevitable, it cannot ignore reality forever. Eventually, a society's structural integrity must be tested. You can only delay the consequences of rot for so long. Like you said, the dashboard warning light can flash, and you can hit the reset button, but if you absolutely refuse to change the oil, the engine is going to seize. And that transition from delayed mercy to inescapable reality is exactly what happens in the third vision. The intercession stops, the locusts and fire fade, and God brings out the plumb line.
Right, the vision of the plumb line and the basket of summer fruit. This is where the text pivots from the threat of external disaster to the reality of internal structural failure. Let's look at the plumb line. For anyone who has ever done carpentry or masonry, a plumb line is incredibly simple. It's just a heavy lead weight attached to a piece of string.
Very basic tool.
Exactly. When you hold the string, gravity pulls the weight straight down, creating an absolutely perfect, unyielding vertical line. Builders use it to see if a wall is straight. So God is standing by a wall that was originally built true to plumb, and he holds the line up to it. The wall of Israel is measured against the objective reality of gravity, and it is found to be bulging, bowing, and structurally unsound. God declares, I will not pass by them anymore.
The shift in imagery there is chilling, really, because of how quiet it is compared to the fire and the locusts.
Yeah, there's no roaring flames.
Right. The plumb line is not an instrument of destruction, it's an instrument of truth. It doesn't knock the wall down. It simply reveals with objective clarity what is already there. A wall doesn't fail because the builder checks it with a plumb line. It fails because it was built crookedly in the first place, and the laws of physics eventually demand a collapse.
That's a great point.
It's a profound statement about the nature of moral truth. Moral decay is a structural issue. When a society builds its institutions on exploitation and injustice, it is building a wall out of plumb. You can paint the wall, you can hang beautiful tapestries on it, you can declare it to be a masterpiece of modern architecture, but gravity does not care about your marketing. The collapse is mathematically certain.
And immediately following the plumb line is the vision of the basket of summer fruit. And there's a brilliant, devastating piece of Hebrew wordplay here that would have landed like a gut punch to the original audience, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The Hebrew word used for summer fruit is quates. And it sounds almost identical to the word for the end, quates. It's a phonetic warning.
It's a dark, prophetic pun, and the agricultural imagery is deeply layered here. Summer fruit represents the absolute final harvest of the agricultural year. It's the end of the line. Furthermore, summer fruit is incredibly beautiful to look at. It's sweet, it smells wonderful, and it represents luxury and abundance. But it has a fatal flaw.
It goes bad quickly.
Exactly. It has an incredibly short shelf life. It is not like grain that can be stored in a silo for years. If you have a basket of ripe summer fruit sitting in the heat of the ancient Near East, it is right on the precipice of rotting. In fact, its peak ripeness is the very beginning of its decay.
Wow.
Israel looks like this basket of beautiful ripe summer fruit. They are wealthy, they're culturally vibrant, they look successful, but God is saying, you are rotten ripe. Your peak prosperity is actually the indicator of your imminent collapse.
And the text does not leave this rot as some vague, abstract theological concept. The commentators are extremely explicit about the specific daily sins that are causing this structural failure. This is where Amos really gets into the economics of exploitation. He paints this visceral picture of the wealthy elites and their religious services. The text says they are sitting there observing the Sabbath and the new moon festivals, but they absolutely hate it.
They're miserable.
Right. They are internally agonizing, eagerly waiting for the holy days to end so they can get back to making money. Their internal monologue is laid bare. When will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale?
The psychological insight here is staggering. These elites are going through the motions of their faith, but their true religion is extraction. They resent the Sabbath because the Sabbath is a mandated pause in production and consumption. It's a day where everyone, even the poorest laborer, is treated with equal dignity and given rest. The elites view this rest as a loss of profit. Their identities are so entirely consumed by the accumulation of wealth that any moment not spent exploiting the market feels like torture. And the moment the sun sets and the Sabbath ends, the text details exactly how they operate. They make the ephah small and make the shekel great.
Let's break down those mechanics because it's a brilliant ancient scam. The ephah is the standard measure of volume for selling grain, like a bushel. The shekel is the standard weight of silver used for payment. So they are intentionally shrinking the size of the bushel basket so the buyer gets less grain than they paid for. Simultaneously, they are using heavier falsified weights on the scales when they weigh the buyer's silver, demanding more money for the lesser amount of food.
Exactly.
They are rigging the system from both ends. They were literally tilting the scales of justice to squeeze every possible ounce of wealth out of a desperate population.
Both Barnes and Henry place a massive emphasis on the profound cruelty of these practices. It isn't just shrewd business. It is the targeted starvation of the vulnerable. They are so consumed by greed that they gather the refuse of the wheat, the dust, the chaff, the sweepings off the threshing floor that are usually given to animals or thrown away, and they market it as good food to people who are too poor to buy anything else.
That is so low.
But the ultimate indictment, the absolute bottom of the moral abyss for this society, is captured in the phrase, "They buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals." They have reduced human beings who are meant to bear the image of the divine to a commodity of the lowest conceivable value. They are trading human lives for footwear.
If we translate this into 21st century realities, it's terrifying how familiar it sounds. The specific tools have changed, but human nature hasn't moved an inch. When Amos talks about making the ephah small and the shekel great, we see the exact same mechanisms today. It's the corporation that subtly shrinks the volume of a product in the packaging while keeping the price the same, relying on the consumer not to notice the deception.
Inflation, yeah.
Exactly. Or it's the predatory lending schemes that target marginalized communities with complex, hidden interest rates that are mathematically designed to keep them trapped in generational debt. It's the systems that view human beings, whether they are warehouse workers, gig laborers, or overseas manufacturers, not as people with inherent dignity, families, and souls, but as mere line items on a spreadsheet, variables to be minimized to maximize the quarterly return for those at the top.
It is a devastatingly accurate parallel. However, as careful readers, we must apply some wisdom with discernment here. The ancient agrarian economy of the 8th century BC is fundamentally different from complex, modern, global markets. We shouldn't blindly map every ancient grievance directly onto modern financial instruments as if they are a one-to-one equivalent.
Fair point.
But the enduring moral wisdom, the truth of the plumb line, remains absolutely clear and authoritative across all eras. Any system, any business model, any national economy that systematically prioritizes profit over human dignity and that structurally treats the poor as disposable resources to be extracted is built crooked. It fundamentally fails the test of the plumb line, and eventually the laws of moral gravity will pull it down.
I think about that image of the elites hating the Sabbath. It's the ancient blueprint for a culture that cannot stop producing. I picture them sitting in the temple, checking their ancient equivalent of a smartwatch, just tapping their feet, agonizingly waiting for the service to end so they can go exploit someone else.
Yeah, that impatience.
They've totally lost the ability to disconnect, to rest, to view the world as anything other than a market to conquer. Which brings a very sharp mirror up to our own lives today. For you listening, where do your daily practices, how you perform your job, how you run your business, how you treat your subordinates, how you spend your money align with the plumb line of justice? Are you honoring the Sabbaths in your life? Meaning, are you respecting the vital boundaries of rest and human dignity for yourself and for those whose labor you rely on? Or have you bought into the illusion that endless accumulation is the highest good, regardless of the human cost?
That is the uncomfortable work of self-examination that the text really demands. And historically speaking, when someone holds up a plumb line and points out deep structural rot in a society, the establishment rarely responds with gratitude.
No, they don't say thank you.
No, they don't form a committee to implement the prophet's suggestions. They attack the messenger. The survival instinct of a corrupt institution is always to silence the critique. This perfectly sets the stage for the dramatic, explosive confrontation that occurs in Section 3 of our deep dive between Amos the herdsman and Amaziah the high priest.
Right. This is where the simmering tension of the book boils over into an open, incredibly dangerous conflict.
Yeah.
We leave the realm of visions and enter real-time geopolitical confrontation. Amaziah is the high priest of the state-sponsored religion at Bethel. Now, Bethel isn't just any shrine. It's the religious heart of the northern kingdom, deeply intertwined with the power of the throne. Amaziah represents the ultimate fusion of religious authority and political establishment. And when he hears Amos preaching this message of the plumb line, he immediately reports him to King Jeroboam.
But notice how he frames the accusation.
Yes. He doesn't say Amos is challenging our theology. He says, Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words.
That framing is politically brilliant and deeply cynical. Amaziah understands that theological debates don't get people executed. Treason does. He weaponizes national security to silence moral critique. He accuses Amos of inciting a rebellion, taking Amos's warnings about the inevitable fall of the kingdom and twisting them into a conspiracy to overthrow the government.
Wow.
It's a classic tactic of power. When a system is confronted with a moral failure it cannot defend, it shifts the narrative to make the critic appear to be an enemy of the state.
And Amaziah doesn't just tattle to the king. He confronts Amos directly, face to face. And his approach is incredibly condescending. He essentially tells Amos, take your little doomsday street preaching act and go home. Flee away to the land of Judah and eat bread there and prophesy there. But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it's the king's sanctuary and is a temple of the kingdom.
The language Amaziah uses is deeply revealing. Go eat bread there. Amaziah operates in a world where everyone has an angle, where religion is a profession, and prophecies are bought and sold based on what the king wants to hear. He simply cannot conceive of a man who is motivated by genuine truth rather than economic gain.
Right, he thinks it's a hustle.
Exactly. He assumes Amos is a religious mercenary looking for a paycheck, and he's telling him his services aren't needed in this market. Furthermore, Amaziah explicitly states that Bethel is the king's sanctuary. He doesn't call it God's sanctuary. The religion has been entirely co-opted by the state. The temple exists to validate the regime, not to hold it accountable.
But Amos claps back with one of the most famous mic-drop defenses in ancient literature. He doesn't argue theology with the priest. He dismantles the priest's entire assumption about who he is. Amos says, I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel.
Amos is deliberately distancing himself from the professional, institutional religious class. He's saying, I am not on your payroll. I don't care about your title. I don't smell like incense. I smell like sheep and tree sap. I am here because the creator of the universe pulled me out of a pasture and told me to speak. He is asserting a moral authority that entirely bypasses the corrupted institutional authority Amaziah represents.
But the confrontation doesn't end with a clever retort. Because Amaziah actively tried to silence the word of truth, Amos delivers a deeply personal, terrifyingly specific prophecy of ruin against Amaziah's own family. He tells the high priest that his wife will be reduced to prostitution in the city, his sons and daughters will die by the sword, his estate will be divided up and given away, and Amaziah himself will die in an unclean foreign land, and Israel will absolutely go into exile.
We have to pause here because this section presents massive obstacles to growth for any modern listener. We need to confront this honestly. The extreme visceral violence of the punishment prophesied against Amaziah's family is highly disturbing to our modern sensibilities. It feels disproportionate and cruel.
It really does. It sounds almost vindictive.
Right. To understand it, we have to situate it within the brutal, unforgiving realities of ancient Near Eastern siege warfare. When a city fell to the Assyrians, it wasn't a polite transfer of governance. It was wholesale slaughter, mass deportation, and the horrific victimization of the surviving women and children, particularly the families of the ruling elite. Amos isn't wishing this upon Amaziah out of petty vindictiveness. He is prophetically stating the brutal historical consequences of a nation that has rejected the protection of moral truth and left itself vulnerable to the meat grinder of ancient empire.
The other major obstacle here is about how we perceive authority. Let's look at this from Amaziah's point of view for a second. Put yourself in his sandals. You are the high priest. You have the education, the robes, the history, the backing of the state. You are responsible for maintaining order in a highly successful, prosperous nation. Suddenly, a completely uncredentialed, blue-collar foreigner from the rival nation to the south wanders into your most sacred space and starts screaming that the king will be assassinated and the country will be destroyed. From a purely administrative, national security perspective, isn't Amaziah's reaction entirely logical? Why wouldn't he deport this agitator?
It is completely logical from the perspective of institutional self-preservation, and that is exactly the comparative insight we need to draw here. This dynamic, the uncredentialed truth-teller versus the massive self-preserving state, it's a universal human archetype. You see this pattern repeated across world history and literature. Well, it's Socrates drinking hemlock in Athens because he dared to question the establishment. It's Thomas More facing execution. It's the modern whistleblower who exposes corporate fraud only to be sued and destroyed by the company's legal team. Institutions, by their very nature, prioritize their own survival and the maintenance of the status quo over disruptive, uncomfortable moral truth. Amaziah cannot hear the warning of the plumb line because he is entirely consumed with protecting the architecture of his own power. He conflates the survival of Jeroboam's regime with the survival of truth itself.
Which translates into a deeply challenging reflection for anyone listening today. Think about your own life, your own work environment, your own family dynamics. How do you react when you are criticized? Especially when that criticism comes from someone you unconsciously deem to be below your station. When an outsider, a junior employee, or someone outside your professional circle points out a flaw in your system or a blind spot in your character, what is your first move? Do you stop and use the plumb line to evaluate the actual truth of their message? Or do you instantly attack their credentials, their tone, or their right to speak in order to protect your own ego and maintain your position? It requires immense radical humility to hear a hard truth from someone who doesn't fit our polished image of an expert.
It does. And the tragedy of Amos is that the establishment utterly failed that test of humility. They silenced the herdsman. But Amos warns that rejecting the truth doesn't eliminate the truth. It just eliminates your access to it. Because the people and the priest rejected the prophet's words, they are about to cross an invisible threshold. They are about to face a reality where the words they despised are withdrawn entirely.
This plunges us into section 4, the famine of the word and the eclipse of meaning. The consequences of silencing the truth begin with a terrifying cosmic disruption. God pronounces a judgment that would have frozen the blood of an ancient audience. He says, "I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight."
This imagery is visceral, and it may have had a very literal anchor in the memories of the people. Albert Barnes, drawing on historical and astronomical records, points out that there were highly visible total solar eclipses in that specific region around 791 and 784 BC.
Oh, wow. So they remembered that.
Yes. For an ancient agrarian society that structured its entire existence around the reliable rhythms of the sun, a total eclipse in the middle of the day was an event of pure existential terror. It felt like the unraveling of the cosmos, a sudden, unnatural reversal of fortune. In the meridian brightness of Israel's economic and political day, sudden night falls. God declares that the joyous religious feasts will turn into mourning, and the triumphant temple songs will curdle into lamentations. The veneer of prosperity will be stripped away in an instant.
But as terrifying as a midday darkness is, the ultimate punishment detailed here isn't astronomical, and it isn't even physical. The text delivers what I think is the most haunting curse in all of ancient literature. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. It goes on to describe the panic this creates. It says people will wander from sea to sea, running back and forth, frantically searching for God's word, for some sense of direction or meaning, but they will not find it. It says that even the strong, the beautiful young virgins, and the young men in the prime of their vitality will literally faint from this metaphysical thirst.
This represents a profound piece of core wisdom. The historical commentators note that the departure of truth is the absolute greatest tragedy a human society can endure. Matthew Henry has a beautifully stark way of summarizing this. He writes, "Brown bread and the gospel are good fare."
I love that.
Yeah. What he means is that enduring physical poverty, eating the cheapest, roughest bread imaginable, while still possessing access to spiritual truth and moral clarity, is an infinitely superior state of existence compared to possessing unimaginable physical wealth while starving to death spiritually. When a society actively silences the voices of moral truth, eventually those voices stop speaking, the prophets go quiet, the truth tellers retreat, and what is left in their wake is a terrifying, echoing silence where meaning used to be.
I don't think any ancient text translates more perfectly into the specific anxieties of the 21st century than this one. We are living in a society that has effectively conquered physical famine in much of the developed world. We have grocery stores packed with thousands of items. Furthermore, we are completely drowning in an ocean of information. We have podcasts, endless articles, infinite scrolling social media feeds, 247 news cycles, analyzing every micro event on the globe. We have generated more data in the last decade than in all of previous human history combined. And yet, amidst this total saturation of information, we are experiencing a profound, devastating famine of meaning, of truth, and of moral clarity.
It's paradoxical, really.
It is. Look at how people are living. They're doing exactly what Amos described, wandering from sea to sea. We jump frantically from one viral wellness trend to another. We doom scroll deep into the night, looking for an explanation for our anxiety. We latch onto political ideologies as if they were religions. We seek out gurus and life hacks, desperately running back and forth looking for an anchor. But the anxiety only deepens, and people are fainting from an existential thirst that data cannot quench.
That distinction you are making between data and wisdom is the exact diagnostic tool we need here. You can possess all the information in the world and still be starving to death spiritually. The Israelites in Amos's day had the massive temple complexes. They had the intricate rituals. They had the choirs. They had all the external trappings of the religion. They had the data. But the actual living voice of truth, the moral center that gives those rituals meaning, was gone. They had silenced it. They were going through the motions in a vacuum.
It's like holding a brand new top-of-the-line smartphone with 100% battery life, but you have absolutely zero signal. You have the hardware, you spend a fortune on it, you have all the processing power and the beautifully designed apps, but you are completely cut off from the network. You are totally isolated. You can tap that glass screen all day long, but nothing of substance is coming through. You have the illusion of connection with none of the reality.
And that metaphor leads to a deeply necessary evaluation of how we construct our own lives. You have to ask yourself, what are you actually drawing from the well? Are you endlessly feeding your mind with empty digital calories, the outrage cycles, the shallow entertainment, the constant noise? Or are you intentionally pursuing genuine, deep-rooted wisdom? When a real crisis hits your life, when the diagnosis comes back bad, when the career fails, when a vital relationship shatters, what internal reservoir do you draw from?
That's the real test.
Right. And when you pull the bucket up from that well, is there actually any life-sustaining water in it? Or is it just the dry dust of passing trends and shallow distractions? To find yourself dying of thirst in a crisis, only to realize the well is dry because you spent your entire life filling it with sand, is the ultimate tragedy.
And when meaning vanishes entirely, when the illusions of wealth and empty religion evaporate, what is left is brutal, inescapable reality. The famine of the word strips away all the padding, which brings us to the final terrifying confrontation in Section 5, the altar and the sieve. The silence is broken by a vision of absolute inevitability.
The scene Amos describes here is staggering. He sees the Lord standing beside the altar, the very center of their corrupted religious system, and commanding the pillars to be struck so violently that the thresholds shake. The sanctuary is coming down on their heads. What follows is a breathtaking, breathless poem detailing the absolute inescapability of divine justice. God declares that human agency is utterly useless against this collapse.
There's nowhere to hide.
Nowhere. Though they try to dig deep into Sheol, the ancient realm of the dead, his hand will pull them back. Though they attempt to climb up to heaven, he will bring them down. If they try to hide in the dense, treacherous cave networks of Mount Carmel, he will hunt them down. Even if they plunge to the very bottom of the ocean floor, he will command the sea serpent to bite them. The poem builds to a terrifying crescendo where God says he will set his eyes upon them for evil and not for good.
The language is completely unyielding. It's claustrophobic. God reminds them of his supreme power as the creator, the one who builds his rooms in the heavens and commands the seawater to pour over the earth. And then he delivers a rhetorical blow that would have been deeply, deeply offensive to their national pride. He looks at Israel, this nation that built its entire identity on being God's chosen people, liberated from Egypt. And he says, "Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Ker?"
This is a massive theological shockwave, and it's a crucial point of wisdom with discernment for us. The Israelites had weaponized their own history. They believed that their historical chosenness, the covenant made with their ancestors, functioned like diplomatic immunity. They thought that because they were the chosen people, they were permanently exempt from the moral consequences that applied to everyone else.
Wow, they really felt untouchable.
They did. And God completely dismantles that exceptionalism. He points out that he is sovereign over the migrations of all nations, the Philistines and the Syrians as well. Being chosen didn't mean they were immune to the rules. It meant they were chosen for a specific responsibility. They were chosen to be a light to the nations, to embody justice and righteousness. Once they abandoned that calling, once they became just as corrupt and exploitative as the empires around them, their historical pedigree meant absolutely nothing. Their ethnic privilege was void.
But let's pause and look at the sheer intensity of the imagery used here. Eyes set for evil. Inescapable swords hunting people down. Mythological sea serpents biting people at the bottom of the ocean. We generally like to think of the moral arc of the universe or the divine nature as a giant safety net. A safety net is comforting. It catches you when you fall. But the metaphor Amos introduces next is not a net. It is a sieve. God says he will sift the house of Israel among all the nations as grain is sifted in a sieve. A sieve doesn't gently catch you. It shakes you violently. It throws you back and forth. If the message here is just inescapable doom and a violent shaking, how is this not just a philosophy of absolute crushing despair?
It absolutely feels like despair if your entire identity is tied to the corruption that is being destroyed. But if we look closely at the mechanics of an ancient agricultural sieve, we find the hidden, enduring hope of the text. The text says, "I will sift the house of Israel among all the nations as grain is sifted in a sieve, yet not the least kernel will fall on the earth." The shaking is violent. Yes, it is terrifying. The entire structure of their society is being dismantled. But the purpose of the shaking is separation, not annihilation.
Okay, so it's not just breaking things for the sake of breaking them.
Exactly. When you sift grain, the goal is to agitate the mixture so violently that the lightweight, useless chaff, the dirt, and the debris are blown away by the wind or fall through the mesh. But the heavy, nutritious, solid kernel of grain, the part that actually sustains life, remains in the sieve. It does not fall into the dirt. God is declaring that the inescapable nature of moral accountability will violently destroy the rot, but it will meticulously preserve the core of what is genuine, true, and righteous.
That reframes the entire concept of suffering and consequence. The safety net catches you to keep you comfortable, allowing you to remain exactly as you are. But the sieve shakes you to reveal what you are actually made of. The violence of the shaking is a purifying force.
Precisely. The inescapable reality is that we cannot outrun the consequences of a crooked plumb line. But the profound hope is that the genuine truth within us, the solid kernel, is precious and will not be lost, no matter how intense the shaking becomes.
Think about what this means when you're going through a season where your own life feels like it is being violently shaken. Maybe you lose a career you built your identity around. Maybe a foundational relationship ends, or a deeply held worldview shatters. When you feel the intense, disorienting vibration of the sieve, the natural instinct is to panic and try to hold on to everything. But the wisdom of Amos asks, can you endure the shaking long enough to identify what is being stripped away? Can you watch the false comforts, the destructive ego, the bad habits, the toxic relationships, the chaff fall away without despairing? And more importantly, when the shaking finally stops, can you identify the solid grain? Can you see the core values, the enduring truths, and the genuine strength that remains?
Enduring the sieve is the only way to reach the foundation. And what is so beautiful about the architecture of this book is that once the sieve has done its work, once the land is finally cleared of the rot and the corruption, the text does not end in silence or permanent destruction. In the final few verses, the book executes a breathtaking pivot into radical, unimaginable restoration.
This brings us to the final movement of our deep dive: the plowman, the reaper, and radical hope. After chapters of fire, locusts, plumb lines, and shaking sieves, the tone completely shifts. God promises to raise up the tent of David that has fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins. And then Amos delivers a promise of hyperabundance that defies the laws of nature.
The imagery used here is overwhelmingly lush. Amos says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes him who sows the seed." He says, "The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it." He envisions a people returning from exile, rebuilding their devastated, wasted cities, planting vineyards, making lush gardens, and being planted in their land so deeply that they will never again be uprooted.
To appreciate how wild this metaphor is, we have to think about the ancient agrarian calendar. Farming is agonizingly linear and slow. You spend weeks brutally plowing the hard earth. Then you sow the seed. Then you wait for months, praying the rains come and the locusts don't. Finally, you have a brief window to frantically reap the harvest. But Amos describes a harvest that is so massive, so incredibly abundant, that the reapers are still out in the fields trying to gather it all in, and the plowman is already stepping on their heels, trying to prepare the ground for the next miraculous season of growth. The seasons are literally tripping over each other because the blessing is so heavy.
Yeah, the calendar is just broken by grace.
Exactly. And the mountains, which in the Middle East are often rocky, arid, and nearly impossible to cultivate, are suddenly dripping with sweet wine.
Both Henry and Barnes, looking back through centuries of historical theology, view this as a profound eschatological prophecy. It is a vision of the Messianic age, representing a continuous, overlapping, compounding abundance of spiritual grace that completely overwrites the previous era of corruption and judgment. It is the exact symmetrical opposite of the first vision.
Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah, we started with locusts eating the fragile aftergrass, leading to starvation. We end with a harvest so aggressive it breaks the calendar. But what is crucial to notice is that this abundance doesn't happen on pristine, untouched land. The text specifically says they will rebuild the waste cities. The restoration happens directly on top of the ruins of the judgment.
I think this speaks so beautifully to the human experience of profound healing, or what modern psychology calls post-traumatic growth. So often we assume that if our lives are burned down, whether by our own incredibly poor choices, or by the cruelty of the systems around us, or by sheer tragedy, that the best we can hope for is to slowly, painfully crawl back to some mediocre baseline. We hope to just survive the ashes. But the prophetic imagination of Amos insists on something far more radical. After the fire, after you've survived the violent shaking of the sieve, there comes a season of compounding grace. It is a time where your newly forged good habits, your carefully restored relationships, and your hard-won wisdom begin to overlap and multiply faster than you can even process them. The healing outpaces the trauma.
That is the essence of radical hope. The restoration makes the previous suffering look small, not by ignoring it, but by repurposing it. The ruins of the waste cities literally become the foundation stones for something stronger and more beautiful than what stood there before. But participating in that kind of restoration requires a massive amount of trust. It requires you to believe that the ruins are not the final word of your story, but the fertilizer for your future.
It is exactly like planting a garden in the immediate aftermath of a devastating forest fire. To the naked eye, everything is black, scorched, and dead. But chemically, the soil is now incredibly rich. The carbon and the ash from the destruction have created the perfect conditions for new life. And the growth that eventually pushes through that black soil is wilder, more untamable, and sweeter than anything that managed to grow there before the fire. But as you said, you have to be willing to plant the seed in the ash.
And that is the ultimate challenge Amos leaves us with. He was a man who looked at a society that arrogantly believed it was at its absolute peak, and he had the courage to see its impending doom. But he also had the profound spiritual vision to look far past that doom, past the destruction, to see a restoration that defied all logic and history.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to carry with you. We've spent this time exploring how an ancient herdsman used his prophetic imagination to see straight through the glittering illusion of a prosperous society to the structural rot underneath. But what if we applied that exact same prophetic imagination to our own potential? What if we could look past our current limitations, our past failures, and our present anxieties? If we can be brave enough to hold the plumb line of truth up to our own lives without flinching, and if we can endure the violent shaking of the sieve, allowing our ego and false comforts to fall away like chaff, we might just find ourselves stepping into a reality we couldn't have predicted. We might step into a season where the plowman overtakes the reaper, where our personal growth, our capacity for empathy, and our hard-won wisdom completely outpace our greatest expectations. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.